They inquire in which way they desire the corpse of their friend to be prepared.
They built pyramids that defy gravity, but their real genius? Staying alive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Long before modern medicine, sunscreen, or survival gear, the ancient Egyptians had hacks. Clever, strange, and sometimes unbelievable. From turning desert insects into hydration tools, to using natural salt to preserve not just the dead, but themselves. These aren't the survival tips you learned in school, and one of them was so powerful it was banned by future kings. The sun was merciless. Sand stretched endlessly. And for many Egyptians, survival hinged on one question. Where do you find water when everything around you looks dead? Surprisingly, the answer sometimes came crawling out of the dirt. Egyptians had no water bottles, no satellite maps, but they had something just as powerful: observation. They noticed that scarab beetles emerged early in the morning, often coated in tiny droplets, dew that had condensed on their shells during the cold desert night. But the real key? The ants. Long black trails of them appeared like clockwork after sunrise, not random, organized, always moving towards shaded rocks, depressions in the earth, and clumps of thirsty vegetation. Where ants went, water wasn't far behind. Ancient texts and tomb illustrations even show these trails leading to places where Egyptians dug shallow wells. Hand-scooped pits barely a foot deep, but just enough to catch hidden groundwater. It was part instinct, part science, and part survival. Modern survivalists still use this trick. In places like the Kalahari and Sinai deserts, insect trails often mark areas where roots store moisture or underground springs sit just beneath cracked stone. But the Egyptians went a step further. They began baiting insects. Some tomb sites show bowls placed near burrows, filled with fermented dates or honey, not as food, but to draw out insects, then watch where they returned. In effect, they hacked the natural GPS of desert life, and in doing so, they discovered more than water. They found a way to make nature talk. In the land of Ra, the sun didn't just shine, it punished. Temperatures soared above 110 degrees, sandstorms whipped across the dunes, and shade was a luxury most couldn't afford. And yet, Egyptian laborers, priests, and royalty didn't just survive under this relentless sun, they endured it for decades. Their secret? A mix of survival instinct and divine ritual. Ancient Egyptians coated their skin in unguent, a paste made from oils, resins, and crushed herbs. To the untrained eye, it looked like decoration. But in truth, it was protection. One blend used sesame oil, prized for its ability to block UV rays and reduce skin damage. Another contained carob extract, full of polyphenols, natural antioxidants that helped shield against environmental stress. Myrrh, a sacred resin used in mummification, doubled as an antiseptic. It soothed burns, healed cuts, and when mixed with beeswax, created a waxy barrier against the sun. And then came natron, the dried salt harvested from lake beds, famous for preserving bodies. But for the living, it did something else. It pulled moisture from the air, neutralized body odor, and prevented sweat rashes. An ancient deodorant and skin purifier in one. These concoctions were applied daily, not just by royalty, but by workers building tombs and harvesting papyrus. And here's where it gets stranger. The same formula used to embalm the dead was used to protect the living. Think about that. The same oils used to preserve a pharaoh's skin for 3,000 years were used by his servants to survive the next 12 hours. One tomb inscription even describes priests applying a balm before desert pilgrimages, calling it the breath of the gods upon the skin. And in 2001, a study found that sesame oil blocks over 30% of UV radiation, rivaling some low-grade modern sunscreens. Ancient protection, modern proof. But this was just one layer of Egyptian ingenuity. What they drank was even stranger. Water was both sacred and deadly. The Nile gave life, but it also carried disease. Parasites, rot, and heat turned clear water into a gamble. So the Egyptians turned to something stranger, a drink so cloudy and bitter that foreigners called it swamp soup. But to the people of Egypt, it was known as zythum, a sacred, fermented barley brew mixed with crushed dates, desert herbs, and a pinch of salt scraped from the lake beds. It was thick, sour, and served warm. But it may have been the first electrolyte drink in history. The barley fermented naturally, creating a low-alcohol liquid that killed off harmful bacteria, making it far safer than plain river water. They didn't just drink it, they trusted it. Workers building the pyramids received daily rations of zythum instead of water. Temples brewed it for healing, and tombs even mention it as an offering to cool the blood and awaken the spirit. Inside, they added fenugreek, an herb known for its cooling effect on the body and digestion. And natron, a salty mineral compound, helped replenish what the sun stole through sweat. Sometimes it was stored in clay jars sealed with palm fibers. Other times it was buried in the ground to ferment slowly in the shade. And while nobles flavored their brews with cinnamon bark and honey, the poor took it straight, bitter and thick, like medicine. But it worked. It gave energy, fought disease, and restored balance in the body. And when you're hauling limestone under the desert sun, balance is the only thing between life and collapse. Zythum wasn't just a drink. It was ancient Egypt's answer to heat, illness, and death. Imagine packing meat in 104-degree heat for a journey across miles of open sand. No ice, no packaging, no backup plan. And yet, the ancient Egyptians didn't just survive with food in that environment, they mastered it. Archaeologists have uncovered sealed jars in tombs that still contain recognizable bread, dried dates, and even strips of meat, all over 3,000 years old. How is that possible? Because Egyptians didn't preserve food with one trick. They used a system. First, salt, specifically natron, the same sacred blend used to mummify pharaohs. When rubbed into meat or fish, it drew out every drop of moisture, and with it, the bacteria that caused decay. Then came the sun. But they didn't just leave meat out to bake. They built drying corridors, narrow walkways between mud brick walls that funneled wind and blocked harsh light. Here, thin-cut meat strips hung from wooden beams, slowly air drying in shaded heat. The goal wasn't to cook, it was to dehydrate without destruction. Once dried, fruits like dates and figs were dipped in honey, not for taste, but for protection. Honey, naturally antimicrobial, acted as a sealant, cutting off oxygen, preventing mold, and locking in what moisture remained. In temples, honey-coated fruits were stored in clay jars sealed with wax, then buried waist-deep in desert sand to keep cool. It was the Egyptian version of a fridge, no electricity required. Even bread had its tricks. They made dense, seed-packed loaves, coated in oil and baked twice to remove all moisture. Some loaves were designed to last for months. Others were baked as offerings and sealed inside tombs. But here's where it gets strange. Egyptians sometimes let food ferment, especially fish sauces called shede or pisesh. To outsiders, they smelled rotten, but inside the clay pots, natural acids formed, preventing further spoilage. What started as rot became preservation. Rot reversed. Death turned to life. In a world obsessed with control, the Egyptians understood something modern science took centuries to learn. Sometimes survival isn't about stopping nature, it's about mastering the decay. The Egyptian sun didn't just shine, it hunted. It cracked clay, baked bones, and made the very air shimmer with heat. But inside an ancient home, it was calm, cool, almost silent. How? They engineered comfort in a place designed to destroy it. At the heart of their survival was mud brick, a humble mix of Nile clay, sand, and straw. It was cheap, abundant, and incredibly smart. Walls made from mud brick were thick, sometimes over 2 feet, acting as thermal armor. By day, the heat couldn't get in. By night, the cool air didn't get out. But passive cooling wasn't just about blocking heat. It was about controlling movement. Homes and temples were built with ventilation channels, shafts or slits high in the walls that released hot air as it rose. Near the floor, low entry slits let cooler air drift in, creating a natural convection cycle, a primitive but powerful air conditioner. And then came the trick, that feels more like magic. Egyptians used water evaporation, one of the oldest cooling hacks in human history. Clay pots filled with water were placed near vents. As the water slowly evaporated, it absorbed heat from the air, cooling it before it flowed through the home. Some even hung reed mats soaked in water at doorways, ancient air curtains that dropped the temperature of incoming breezes. And if you think this was just for the rich, think again. From pharaohs' palaces to farmers' huts, these principles were everywhere, baked into the architecture like hidden survival codes. Even temples were designed for airflow. Their entrances faced east, catching the gentlest morning winds. Thick rear chambers faced west, where the burning sun hit and never entered. Inside certain tomb walls, inscriptions praised builders who could quiet the heat. A spiritual reference to engineers who mastered cooling. But the strangest part? Some walls were intentionally hollow. Hidden inside jars of cool water, stacks of clay vessels, and bundles of palm fiber insulation, layered like the inside of a modern cooler. These cavities held cold night air and slowly released it throughout the day. To outsiders, it was just a wall. To the Egyptians, it was a living machine. Their goal wasn't just shelter, it was climate control without a single drop of electricity. And it worked so well that modern desert architects still borrow their techniques today. They built homes the sun couldn't touch. In ancient Egypt, a single infected cut could mean death. Sand carried bacteria, flies laid eggs in wounds, and the sun only made everything worse. So how did they survive before antibiotics, soap, or even the idea of germs? They used rot to stop rot. Egyptian healers treated wounds with honey, not for sweetness, but for defense. Honey was applied directly to cuts, burns, and even surgical incisions. It formed a sticky barrier that sealed the wound, suffocated bacteria, and accelerated healing. And they knew it worked. In the Ebers Papyrus, a 110-page scroll from around 1550 BCE, there are over 500 prescriptions, many combining honey with grease, linen, or crushed minerals. But honey was just the beginning. When wounds began to fester, when pus, swelling, or heat appeared, healers reached for moldy bread. They didn't understand penicillin, but they did know that certain green breads seemed to pull infection out of the skin. Instructions from the Hearst Medical Papyrus describe placing moldy barley dough upon the bite of the serpent or over the rot of the flesh. And modern studies? They confirm that strains of Penicillium mold used this way could have had real antibacterial effects. Still sound primitive? Egyptians also used copper salts, gisol, like malachite and verdigris, crushed into powders and applied to wounds. Copper ions kill microbes on contact, a technique that is still used today in antimicrobial surfaces. Their surgical practices were surprisingly advanced too. They used linen thread soaked in tree resin to stitch wounds, and the resin acted like glue and antiseptic. Surgical knives made of copper or obsidian were sharpened with quartz sand, then sterilized in boiling water or cleansed with fermented palm wine, early alcohol. The tools were clean, the techniques were consistent, and the mindset? Healing wasn't just physical. Egyptian doctors called Azobnw often worked alongside priests. They would chant spells to protect the patient from demons of rot. Unseen forces they believed entered the body through broken flesh. These chants weren't empty words. They calmed the patient, focused the healer, and created an atmosphere of seriousness and trust. One record tells of a man with a deep foot wound treated using honey, linen, and copper, who was walking again after 5 days. In a time before science understood bacteria, Egyptians were fighting infection with mold, minerals, and ritual. And the mold they used? It behaves almost exactly like penicillin. Over 3,000 years before Fleming ever touched a petri dish. Wounds could be stitched, bones could be set, but the pain? In ancient Egypt, it could haunt a person for days or drive them to madness. Yet somehow, the Egyptians endured it, with no opioids, no injections, and no modern relief. Their secret? A flower, the blue lotus, a sacred symbol seen in countless tombs, offerings, and rituals, but also a plant with real chemical power. The petals were steeped in wine or warm water, then sipped slowly. The result? A mild euphoria, a numbing calm. Modern science has found that blue lotus contains a porphine, a psychoactive alkaloid that acts like a mood stabilizer and mild sedative. For pain, it dulled the edges. For grief, it muted the noise. But this wasn't just pharmacology. It was mental mastery. Priests led breathing rituals, chanting patterns designed to slow the heart rate and center the mind. Patients focused on symbolic objects, amulets, oils, even flame, in a kind of proto-meditation. Combined, it worked. The flower calmed the nerves, while the ritual focused the mind away from suffering. A psychological survival tactic 3,000 years ahead of its time. Even today, blue lotus is used in alternative medicine and banned in several countries due to its psychoactive properties. Pain couldn't be erased, but in Egypt, it could be silenced. In ancient Egypt, death often came quietly, on the tip of a fang. Scorpions in your sandals, cobras in your walls. One sting, one bite, and the countdown began. But Egyptians didn't run. They fought back with venom. First, they trained in recognition. Scrolls like the Brooklyn Papyrus list dozens of snakes and scorpions detailing symptoms and cures. Some temples had priests dedicated to venom, trained to treat and possibly even extract it. In some cases, Egyptians applied microdoses of venom mixed with herbs and wine, trying to build resistance or counter-stimulate the body. Sound crazy? Modern science calls this hormesis, the idea that small doses of poison can actually protect or heal. Cobra venom was also used in salves for joint pain and inflammation, likely working as a localized nerve suppressor. But medicine wasn't their only defense. Egyptians carved serpent gods into everything. The uraeus, a rearing cobra, was placed on crowns and tombs to psychologically ward off attackers. Some believed venom wasn't just physical, it was spiritual corruption, and only ritual could cleanse it. Healers would chant spells to chase the fire from the blood while applying crushed herbs soaked in beer, honey, and natron. But one account speaks of a venom so strong it didn't kill, it froze. The bite locked the body in paralysis, a living death. And Egyptians believed this venom could be used as a weapon or a cure, depending on who held the dose. The desert wasn't just empty, it was a maze that changed with the wind. Sand dunes shifted overnight, landmarks vanished by noon, and mirages lured travelers into dead ends. But the Egyptians, they navigated with no compass and almost never got lost. Their secret was observation, refined into survival art. They studied shadows. A simple stick planted in the ground told them the time, the direction, and, with enough skill, the estimated distance traveled. By watching the sun's arc and shadow length, they could estimate how far east or west they'd moved over time. They read the winds, tracked the growth direction of the desert plants, and even followed the behavior of ants and beetles to find moisture-rich paths. In long journeys, they planted stone markers called desert teeth, small cairns stacked in irregular shapes, each one aligned with the next, guiding travelers like ancient breadcrumb trails. Some used animal tracking, not to hunt, but to navigate. Camels, goats, and even wild birds often followed ancient water paths etched invisibly into the land. Egyptian desert scouts memorized these paths through repetition, turning routes into mental maps passed down from elder to apprentice. Even in total darkness, some could travel by scent and sand texture, noting how coarse grains or sulfuric smells hinted at nearby terrain changes. Modern survivalists still use these techniques, shadow sticks, wind lines, and animal tracking, in regions like the Kalahari and Sahara. But Egypt pushed it further. One priesthood used navigation methods to locate buried tombs beneath the dunes, identifying ground that was slightly cooler, denser, or cracked unnaturally. They called it reading the earth's skin, and it worked. In Egypt, death wasn't a surprise. It was scheduled, prepared for, rehearsed, while others feared it. Egyptians studied it, sculpted it, and even paid to simulate it. Mummification wasn't just for royalty. It was a ritual available to farmers, merchants, even soldiers. Tombs weren't graves. They were survival shelters for the soul. And the strange part? This obsession with death made them more alive. When you believe your actions echo forever, your choices sharpen. When you know your body will be wrapped and preserved, you treat it with care. When every scar is seen as a story for the gods, pain becomes purpose. In times of war or famine, this mindset gave Egyptians an edge. They stayed calmer, more focused. They acted not out of panic, but legacy. Even their language reflected this. The word for tomb, Per-Nefer, meant house of beauty. It wasn't an ending, it was a transition. And modern psychologists now recognize this type of mindset as a survival tool. Today it's called memento mori, the act of facing death in order to live better. The Egyptians had their own version, and it worked. Because in confronting the end, they became the most enduring civilization on Earth.